In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Please be seated. Evangelism. We joke about this in the Episcopal Church as being a four-letter word because it's too Protestant or too pushy or too much like we're selling something. And yet, if we're being honest with ourselves, we secretly admire those churches that go out and bring people in like so many fish, bursting the nets of our expectations. If only we had someone who could do that for us. Wouldn't that be great? So which is it? Is evangelism this unseemly thing, or is it something really good to do? The answer, in the words of my father, yes. Evangelism's problem is that it's misunderstood. And since we don't understand it, we avoid it. Even when we decide that we're going to do a little evangelism, we're a lot like those disciples who went out fishing and ended up bringing up nothing. So, why do we do evangelism in the first place? In this church or in any church? Why do we do it? And what is the future of evangelism for us, right here at St. James? Let's go back to the image of the fisherman that Luke talks about in today's gospel. Leaving aside the fact that these guys are supposed to be professionals and normally know what they're doing, we can see a couple of major evangelism mistakes in the story. First, they're looking in the wrong spot. Do you notice they go out there, they throw the net in there, they do this all night long, they never move. They stay in the same spot, throwing the net down, bringing up nothing, all night long. They never move. You just stay in the same place. Remembering that this is sort of an allegory for evangelism, we see the same thing. Often we stay where we are and assume that things will change. Assume that people will come to us. I mean, most of the churches in the Episcopal Church, they have these signs that says, the Episcopal Church welcomes you. That's enough, right? I mean, lets people know that they're welcome, they should be coming. Actually, you may not know this, but St. James doesn't have one of those signs. We used to, but we got rid of it and got a bigger one. I have to admit, though, I wouldn't mind having a couple of these signs scattered, here, so up Route 9 and down Route 9 and on 9G. That would be nice. But here's another part of that. Those signs aren't evangelism. They're good, but they're not evangelism. Neither is sitting here and waiting for the people to come. That's not evangelism, that's isolation. We are a relationship faith. We are not made to be in isolation. Now, it is true that this church in this country used to be able to get away with that pretty easily. Because there was an era where everybody went to church. Not because they were more religious, but because the pressures were such that you had to. For some folks, literally their jobs depended on being seen at church. For others, they would pick the right church, the one, where the bosses went, where all the movers and the shakers were. But this wasn't evangelism, it was networking. Still, that was better than what passed for evangelism in earlier times, where the good news of Jesus Christ was brought at the tip of a sword or the barrel of a gun. Let me just be clear on this in case we're in any doubt. Forced conversion is not evangelism. In fact, it's about as far from Christ as you can get. But I get ahead of myself. So the first mistake of the disciples in their whole fishing scenario was going to the wrong place and staying there. And you won't find people to bring to Christ if you're in the wrong place and you're staying there. And you know where the wrong place is to find people to bring to Christ? Here, because you're already here. You got to get out of these doors if you actually want to practice evangelism. But they had a second mistake in this parable, in this story as well. And their second mistake was that they were out there for the wrong reason. They were out there for profit. Now you might say to me, wait a minute, these are professional fishermen. That's the whole point of going fishing, is to make a profit. And that's true. But remember that Jesus is using this moment to teach about evangelism. And as long as they're out there for themselves, they will not be doing what they need to be doing. Notice in the story, it's only when they do what Jesus asks of them that suddenly they're successful in the fishing that they're doing. One of the problems for us in evangelism is that we too often approach it for the wrong reasons. We approach evangelism to profit from it. You know, and again, if we're going to be honest with ourselves, just think for a moment, and this is particularly true for people who have been on the vestry before. But who hasn't thought to themselves, we just need to fill those pews so we can get more pledges? Once at a meeting in the diocese, I even had somebody in a diocesan office say as much. We were talking about how we were financially strapped, and they said, we'll get more members. As if the purpose of having more members is to get more money. It's not. Nor is the purpose of gaining more members to increase the size of the choir, or to increase the Sunday school, or to get more folks involved in the altar guild, or to get more pledge clerks. That's not the purpose of bringing people into this place. The reason for and the location of evangelism matter. And we're looking in the same old place, or we're doing it for the wrong reasons. And if we're doing that, the results will not be what Jesus asked for. Now, it's important to note that you can quite successfully bring in people to church by the thousands and still not be doing what Jesus asked. You can haul them in for the wrong reasons. But remember this, the word evangel, that means good news. Evangelism is sharing good news. For those who go out and prey upon vulnerable people, threatening them with hellfire if they don't convert, or promising them riches on this life if they join, that's not evangelism. That's extortion or snake oil salesmanship. You get people, but you miss the good news. Our job as evangelists is to share good news. St. Paul wrote in his letter to the Corinthians that I handed on to you as of first importance what I in turn received. And in so many words, what he received was the love of Christ, who lived and died and rose again for our sake. Who lived and died and rose again to break down the walls that separate us from God and from each other. And In Paul's terminology, he called that wall sin. So our job as evangelists is to pass on to others what we ourselves have received. That God, who created and loves this world, also created and loves us, each of us. That there's no threat attached to it, no sales pitch, no promise of riches, no threat of fire, just a relationship. But a relationship where you are assured of very little other than you will never walk alone. Yesterday I attended the Absalom Jones feast at the cathedral. It was actually an amazing event, and if anybody wants to come with me next year, Jeff Fishwick came with me, and he said, wow, that was great. He came to the 8 o'clock, and he stood up after the announcements and said, I just want to tell you, you got to come. What an amazing service, what an amazing cathedral. There were about 1,000 people there, and the preacher was Bishop Jennifer Baskerville Burroughs of the Diocese of Indianapolis. She was originally actually from the Diocese of New York, which has the largest cathedral in the Episcopal Church, and now she's Bishop of Indianapolis, which has the smallest cathedral in the Episcopal Church. It was so small that when she was looking for it, she thought it was just some little chapel. But she spoke about God's dream for us, and about how God's dream for us is a good story. A story in which all of us are for all of us. Everyone for everyone. The problem is that we often write very different stories. The stories we write with our lives are often stories of greed, or fear, or anger, or suspicion, or isolation and loneliness. And those stories drive us further away from that dream. Last night, Liz and I went to go see a movie, Bohemian Rhapsody. I don't know if any of you have seen it. It's about the story of Freddie Mercury, who was the lead singer for the band Queen. And one of the things about that movie was his intense, first of all, popularity. Talk about, a real rock star. But his intense loneliness. In the midst of all this, everybody wants to be his friend. He's just the most incredibly lonely person. And even though he dies at an early age from disease, it's also a redemption story because he learns how to like himself, and he learns how to find actual friendship with people who care about him. When our story is a story of this isolation and loneliness, or greed, fear, anger, suspicion, all those things, they're all wrapped up into each other, Then it feels like there is no other option. There's no other story out there. But what Bishop Baskerville Burroughs said is that the good news is that we can always write a new story. Evangelism is simply listening to the stories of those around us and letting them know that their story isn't over. Evangelism is sharing our stories and making it abundantly clear that we are constantly writing a new one. We are constantly editing, constantly working on a new line. That's the dream of God. That we keep writing and rewriting, that we have the freedom to keep writing and writing. And we'll get there in the end. The purpose of evangelism then is to share. To share our stories, to share the love God has for us, to share our questions, and to share our lives. It's just as much for us, however, as it is for those we reach out to. Because without this sharing, without this mandate to share, we tend to collapse in on ourselves, to isolate ourselves, to become at best a clique, but ultimately a tomb. Without sharing the love of Christ, we are nothing. Now, we all say, yeah, that makes sense, that makes sense. Sharing is good. Evangelism is good. We like it. If only we had someone who could do that for us. Which brings us to Isaiah. Remember, at this point, Isaiah is a kid. A kid who doesn't think much of his own abilities. I'm too young. I'm not smart enough. I can't do it. But every time he brings up an objection, it doesn't work. God has chosen him. And one by one, God removes every excuse Isaiah might have in order to not act. So that finally, when God says, "Whom shall I send and who will go for us?" Isaiah says, "Here am I, send me." Here we are. God has removed our excuses. Evangelism requires only listening and sharing your story. And although I don't know a lot about everybody, I do know this. Everyone has a story. All God needs now is for you to say, "Here am I, send me." Amen.